Lucia Reyes tightened the strap on her cleaning bucket, shoulders aching from her sixth straight night shift. Her janitor uniform clung slightly damp, carrying the sting of bleach and the scratch of old fabric. Every footstep echoed down the marble hallway of the Travis County Courthouse, like a whispered reminder she didn't belong. The fluorescent lights flickered above as she reached the top-floor executive meeting chamber. Lucia nudged the door open with her elbow, careful not to leave smudges. She always got assigned the sensitive areas, because she was quiet, because she never asked questions. But that day, amidst a pile of folders on the long mahogany table, one paper had slipped out. The title caught her eye, printed in both English and German: Vertrag zur Ethikprüfung, Judicial Integrity Agreement. Lucia froze. The right column, all German. Her eyes scanned instinctively. Im Falle einer festgestellten Unregelmäßigkeit, in case of an identified irregularity. Her heart thudded. Her hand trembled. Not from cold. You can read that a deep voice cut through the air. Lucia turned. Judge Harold Wilson, arms folded, leaned in the doorway. His gaze sharpened with amusement. You know, German Reyes, or just plain courthouse spy. She gently set the document down, eyes lowered. I was only cleaning, sir. Wilson stepped forward, smirking. Curiosity's not a crime. Crossing the line is, if you're so clever, translate the whole thing. I want your version on my desk by Sunday. I could use a laugh. Lucia didn't respond. But deep inside, something that had slept for years began to stir. The courthouse lights dimmed on schedule. Somewhere, a clock chimed midnight. The world kept moving. But for Lucia, everything had just shifted. Follow Unveiled Wealth, everything is about to change. That night, long after the courthouse emptied, Lucia sat alone in the janitor's supply room. The hum of the vending machine was the only sound. In front of her, laid out on the small metal desk, was the contract. Her eyes traced every line. The legal terms in German stirred something in her brain, something that had been asleep since college. She pulled out an old spiral notebook and began translating by hand, clause by clause, word by word, line by line. She didn't need the internet. It was all still in her memory. At 1:27, she paused. Her pen hovered above the page. There it was, a phrase buried halfway down in the event of verified misconduct. The court's presiding authority may be subject to temporary suspension, pending external review. She reread it 3 times. It wasn't vague. It wasn't symbolic. It was power. If proven true, that clause could remove a sitting judge. Lucia exhaled slowly. Her fingers trembled. The mop bucket in the corner creaked as the building settled. In that moment, she wasn't a janitor. She was a translator, a witness, a threat, and someone she realized would want her silent. The next day, Judge Wilson walked past her near the stairwell. He didn't smile. He didn't speak, but he paused. His eyes lingered on her just 1 second longer than usual. She kept mopping, but her heart beat faster. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay on the small cot in her apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word of the clause in her head. The words weren't just ink anymore. They were a trigger, a risk, a beginning. The heater in her apartment groaned, coughing warm air that didn't reach her feet. Somewhere outside, a siren faded into the distance. But inside her chest, the noise was deafening. She rolled to her side, stared at the glow of the contract still on her desk, and whispered to the dark, "What do I do with this?" No one answered, but the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt loaded. The morning after, Lucia moved through the courthouse halls with her usual quiet rhythm, but something had shifted. The air felt tighter. Conversations dropped when she passed. A secretary who usually offered a polite nod now turned away, too quickly. Near the staff elevator, a clerk muttered, "She thinks she's more than a janitor now," just loud enough for her to hear. Lucia didn't respond. She never did. But that morning, she gripped the mop handle tighter. Her knuckles whitened. Her breathing slowed, controlled, eyes down, but ears sharp. In the break room, she overheard a staffer joke about a cleaning lady with a spy complex. Laughter followed, but it didn't last long. Even jokes carried weight now. Judge Wilson, on the other hand, was louder than usual. In a meeting with the department heads, his voice thundered through the closed doors. "We are not here to debate numbers. We are here to present stability. So make the books match the message," he barked. The walls trembled with his tone. That afternoon, he snapped at the receptionist for leaving a file card in the hallway. He berated a court clerk for misplacing a delivery slip. And when the intern spilled coffee near his office, he stared for a beat too long, then said coldly, "Some people need to remember where they stand." 3 times that day, Lucia heard his name rise in whispers. First, from a junior accountant who rushed into a locked office carrying 2 versions of the same report. Then, from the mailroom where an overnight envelope from the Department of Corrections sat unopened for hours. And last, in the women's restroom, where a legal assistant whispered over speakerphone, "If the clause is real, he's done." Lucia knew then she wasn't the only one reading. She wasn't invisible anymore. That night, Lucia stayed long past her shift again. In the supply room, beneath the dull hum of fluorescent lights, she flipped through her notes. The words she'd translated replayed over and over in her mind. But now, they weren't just clauses. They were matches. And Judge Wilson was the dry field. She started making copies of the key pages just a few at a time, slipped them between cleaning rosters, hid one inside a roll of blue trash liners. She wasn't paranoid. She was careful. The tension around her only grew. In a hallway dispute over budgeting, Wilson slammed his palm against a conference table. "We do not mention audits in this building unless you're prepared to lose your job," he said to the finance manager, who shrank in her seat. Later, Lucia watched from a distance as Wilson pulled Susan Whitmore, the lead accountant, into his office. The blinds closed. His voice wasn't loud, but his gestures were sharp. When she emerged, Susan's face was drained. Her eyes met Lucia's briefly, then dropped. The next morning, the weekly operations bulletin was scrubbed clean. No mention of pending contracts. No mention of oversight. Just weather alerts and birthday announcements. Even silence was being edited. Lucia wiped the fingerprint smudge glass of the main entrance. She could feel it. The building was holding its breath. That same afternoon, Wilson walked into the mailroom where 2 junior clerks were whispering over an envelope marked "Preliminary Financial Review." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply stepped between them, took the envelope, and tore it in half. "If I hear one more word about reviews, I'll clean this whole floor out myself." Nobody laughed. Lucia, watching from behind a cleaning cart, stood still, her breath shallow, her eyes locked on the pieces of that envelope still drifting to the floor. Later, in the janitor's room, she pulled out a folded page from her apron. She added a single line in red pen to the margin, "Clause 17B, enforceable under federal contract law." Then she tucked it deep into her notebook. She was no longer just translating, she was preparing a record. The kind someone might need when this whole place cracked open. The lights in the courthouse flickered more than usual that week. Or maybe Lucia just noticed them more. Every creak in the floor, every click of a door latch. She moved like usual, silent, swift but now with purpose. In the basement file room, where the air smelled of paper and mildew, she began assembling a copy, one master file. Every critical clause, every signature, every page that mentioned external review or financial compliance. She kept it in an unmarked folder, labeled only with a single word in red ink: integrity. It was late Friday when she saw Wilson walking briskly down the hall, jaw clenched. Behind him, Susan Whitmore followed with a folder clutched to her chest. Her eyes darted side to side. When they passed Lucia, neither spoke. But Susan's hand trembled. Minutes later, 2 IT staff rolled in a locked cart and entered records without a word. They stayed for over an hour. When they left, the cart was empty. By Saturday morning, every terminal in the file room displayed a blue screen that read, "System maintenance, access suspended." Lucia stared at the screen, then at her hands, then at the folder in her cleaning bin. Still there, still untouched. She'd been right to move in silence. And now, she was the last one holding the truth. Lucia waited until Sunday evening. The courthouse was nearly empty. Only a few lights remained on, mostly in the security wing and near the entrance. It was the safest time to move. She entered the basement archive again, not to clean, but to scan. In a quiet corner, where an old microfilm reader sat unused, she brought out the folder labeled Integrity. Page by page, she fed the documents into the scanner. Each beat felt like a countdown. Her hands moved fast. Her breath stayed shallow. When she finished, she didn't email them. She saved them to a small flash drive, tucked inside the lining of her cleaning cart's glove compartment. Then, she wiped the scanner history. She'd learned that trick years ago. Back upstairs, she passed Susan Whitmore near the elevator. They didn't speak, but Susan paused. Her eyes lingered on the cart, on Lucia's hands. Lucia gave the smallest nod. It was enough. That night, in her apartment, Lucia typed in silence. One sentence at a time. No accusations. No drama. Just facts. To whom it may concern at the Office of Federal Judicial Ethics. Attached are excerpts of a judicial contract involving federal funds. Please review Clause 17B and associated financial statements for irregularities. Sincerely, she didn't sign it. She attached the files, closed the beer, closed the browser. Then she sat back and listened to the hum of her fridge, the silence in her hallway, the steady thump of her own heart. 3 days passed. Nothing happened. At least, not on the surface. The courthouse returned to its routine. Judges in pressed robes, staffers whispering over case files. The copy machine broke again. Someone brought donuts. Lucia swept the marble floors like always. She changed trash bags. She smiled when spoken to. But under it all, she listened. On the second day, she noticed Susan staying later than usual. Her door closed. Lights on. A folder marked Redline Review sat on her desk, just barely visible. On the third, 2 men in suits, not courthouse regulars, walked through the East Wing, escorted by security. One carried a leather briefcase. The other wore a pin that read, Ethics Oversight. They didn't look at Lucia, but they looked at everything else. Wilson was louder that day, barking into his phone, demanding conference calls, tearing open interoffice envelopes with visible force. He didn't acknowledge her once. Until late that afternoon. She was mopping the side hall when he stepped out of a meeting room and saw her. He froze for a second, then gave a half smile, not friendly, measured. Lucia Reyes, he said. Lucia straightened. You ever notice how some people mistake silence for weakness? She met his eyes. No, sir, she said calmly. I think silence just makes people uncomfortable. He didn't reply. He walked away, but for the first time, his footsteps didn't sound sure. Long before she mopped court hallways, Lucia Reyes stood at the front of a university lecture hall, reciting legal clauses in German before a panel of professors. She wore a blazer 2 sizes too big and spoke with a calm precision that made every syllable land. When she finished, the room was quiet for a beat too long. Then applause. Her mentor, Professor Adler, smiled at her over his glasses. Lucia, he said, you are one of the sharpest legal translators I've seen in 20 years. Your mind is exact, elegant. You're going places. And she believed him. She had a scholarship, a part-time job at the International Law Library, and a planned graduate, join a global arbitration firm, travel, send money back home. She studied late, annotated every textbook, and started dreaming in legal German. At night, she would sit on her dorm bed and call her parents. Her father would talk about the factory. Her mother would tell her not to forget vitamins, and she never missed a Sunday call. Until one Sunday, no one picked up. When she finally got through, her uncle answered. Her father had been detained during a routine ID check. The papers were wrong, or expired, or it didn't matter. He was being processed for deportation. Lucia left campus the next day. She never told Adler. She never withdrew officially. She just disappeared from the system. By the time her mother collapsed from a stroke 3 weeks later, Lucia was already back in El Paso, trying to keep the lights on, trying to keep her mother breathing. The blazer was gone. The textbooks packed into a box she never opened again. Lucia never reapplied. She never asked for an extension, or a leave of absence, or even advice. She folded her dream and filed it in the back of her mind like an old case, brief no one would ever review. For years, she floated between jobs, cleaning offices, sorting mail, watching her mother sleep in the next room. Her German faded a little, but never disappeared. She still thought in clauses sometimes, especially when she was nervous. Subjunctive verbs, passive constructions, legal nuance hiding in quiet syntax. Every time she passed a courthouse, even just as a pedestrian, she looked up at the columns, wondering if her life had simply missed the right doorway. But now, 10 years later, the language had come back, not in a classroom, not in a courtroom, but in the still air of a supply room, in a file no one expected her to read. Her hands had changed. Her back ached more. Her nails were short and clean, not painted like the girls in college, but her mind still sharp, still elegant. Professor Adler's voice echoed again, not as a memory, but as a reminder. You're going places, maybe not the way he imagined, but maybe somewhere better. At night, when she lay on her cot and the courthouse was just a silhouette in her window, Lucia would sometimes whisper legal phrases into the dark. not to study, not to remember, just to feel like herself again. The girl who once debated case law in 2 languages. The woman who now carried that skill like a hidden blade, sharp, precise, waiting. The day after Lucia sent the documents, the courthouse felt colder. Not in temperature, but in tone. People whispered less. Footsteps softened. Even the air vents hummed like they didn't want to disturb anything. Lucia moved through it all like fog quiet, unseen, but everywhere. On Tuesday, a new memo appeared in the staff bulletin. All inquiries regarding fiscal partnerships must be directed to the interim legal office. No one knew what that meant. But Susan Whitmore's office light burned later and later. Lucia emptied bins outside that door every night. She never spoke. But she noticed more folders marked internal only stacked on Susan's desk. And sometimes, a handwritten sticky note hold for review. The security guard, Mr. Pelton, who usually nodded half asleep, now sat fully upright, watching Ninwari Kamun, logging names, checking IDs that no one had checked in months. Lucia's routine didn't change. She still mopped, still sanitized, still scrubbed away fingerprints that never asked to be noticed. But her path curved differently now. She passed more closed doors, more silences. Late Wednesday evening, she stood alone in the west stairwell, catching her breath after hauling a cart up a floor. The silence there felt different, like the pause before a gavel. She reached into her coat pocket and felt the USB drive. Still there, just in case. From below, voices echoed, faintly muffled, but firm. Clause 17, financial discrepancy. She didn't need to hear the rest. Lucia turned back to her cart. 1 floor left. As she moved, she caught her reflection in a glass panel, same uniform, same quiet steps. But her posture had changed. Straighter, more deliberate. A court clerk passed her and didn't avoid eye contact. Didn't smile either. Just nodded, almost respectfully. Outside Judge Wilson's wing, a new sign was posted, access restricted. By appointment only. It wasn't there yesterday. Someone had scribbled over a name on the mail slot with black marker. Lucia paused beside it, then kept walking. Somewhere deep inside, the courthouse had started rearranging itself. Not loudly, but with certainty, and though no one said her name, she could feel the story taking shape around her. Like dust gathering before a storm. The summons came Thursday morning. A full staff address, mandatory attendance. No agenda, nirrisisimonas, no details. Just a time and a place main hall. 3 or 3 mix Syrian. By 2:30, the courthouse buzzed louder than usual. Staff lined the walls. Department heads filed in, whispers trailing behind them. Lucia stood in the back near the double doors, mop in hand, pretending to clean a spill that didn't exist. Judge Wilson entered with the poise of a man who thought he was hosting the ceremony, not walking into judgment. His robe crisp, his stride confident, his voice steady as he approached the lectern. Today, he began, marks a renewed chapter for our courthouse. Our commitments to transparency and fiscal responsibility remain stronger than ever. People nodded. Some clapped. But not all. A man in a gray suit near the front row raised his hand. Judge Wilson, he said, his tone calm. Official, Wilson paused. Yes, Somersons. My name is Alan Beck, Office of Federal Judicial Ethics. Before you proceed, we'd like clarity on Clause 17B of your federal compliance contract. The room froze. Wilson blinked. Clause what? Beck opened a folder. 17B. The clause regarding financial misrepresentation and temporary removal procedures. Someone coughed in the back. A paper slipped from a staffer's hand. I don't have that language in front of me, Wilson said. We do, said Beck, holding up a copy. Lucia tightened her grip on the mop. Beck continued. Would you prefer we read it? Or perhaps someone more familiar with its language structure could assist. Eyes turned. Toward her, Lucia didn't move right away. For a second, no one did. Then Beck turned, scanning the room, his eyes settling on her. Reyes, correct. You have experience with legal German. Would you mind assisting? Murmurs swelled. A few heads turned sharply. A janitor assists in legal interpretation. Lucia stepped forward. Her cart stayed behind. She walked slowly, not hesitating but deliberate, as if every footstep was placed with thought. Not fear. Wilson's eyes followed her, but his mouth didn't move. The color in his face began to shift. Lucia took the offered copy from Beck. Her fingers didn't shake. She scanned the paragraph, nodded once, then read aloud. Im Falle einer festgestellten Unregelmäßigkeit in der Finanzberichterstattung. Then she translated. In the event of a confirmed irregularity in financial reporting, the presiding judicial authority may be suspended pending external ethics review. She looked up. Calm, Mifri. Steady. Wilson took a breath, then forced a chuckle. That clause isn't active. It's conditional boilerplate. Beck didn't smile. We've already initiated a preliminary review, Judge, and we've received not just this clause, but supporting evidence. Susan Whitmore stood from the second row. She held a folder. Firm Piranhas for an, straight. She said, clearly, the numbers in the original reports were altered. I have the backups. The originals match what Ms. Reyes submitted. Gasps now. Real ones. Lucia didn't speak. She didn't need to. Wilson's mouth opened, then closed. Sirmerno, Sirmequintu. His hands flattened on the lectern like he needed it to stay upright. The hall fell into silence. Wilson looked around, as if expecting someone to speak up, to step in, to say this was all a misunderstanding. But no one did. Beck spoke again, voice steady. Per our review authority, we'll be conducting a full audit effective immediately. Until its completion, Judge Wilson, your access to all financial and administrative systems is suspended. The words hit like a gavel. Wilson stepped back from the lectern. His hands hovered at his sides, unsure of what to do. Then he turned too quickly and spotted Lucia still standing. You, he said, barely above a whisper, then louder. You did this, Lucia didn't blink. Beck intervened. She did what was necessary. But Wilson wasn't hearing him. He took a step forward. You think a janitor can rewrite a courthouse? You think they'll let you stay after this? Lucia answered calmly. I didn't rewrite anything. I just stopped the erasing. Security stepped into the aisle, not rushing, just waiting. Wilson looked at them, then back at the crowd, then at Susan. He laughed once, short, bitter, into one. I built this place, he muttered. No, Susan said. You just ran it into silence. Wilson didn't fight. He just walked past the rows of quiet faces, past Beck, past Lucia. As he reached the back doors, he paused. He turned once more, eyes searching for something he couldn't name. Then he left. Lucia stood still for a moment longer. The mop still leaned quietly against the wall, where she'd left it. When she finally moved, she didn't return to it. Instead, she turned toward Beck, who met her gaze and gave the smallest nod. Behind her, someone clapped, just once, then another. Watch her and one. Within seconds, the whole room was filled with the soft sound of applause, not thunderous, not explosive, just steady, like rain tapping on a courthouse roof. After the hall cleared, Beck approached her. Minaziu, Reyes, do you have a moment? She nodded. He led her into the side chamber, the one Wilson used to call his private conference room. Now, it felt different. Lighter, Yursari Waninman, Sesunatuan. Beck gestured to a chair. She sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. We'll be installing interim leadership during the audit, he said, but we need someone inside. Someone who understands the language, the system, and the gaps between them. Lucia didn't say anything. I read your notes, Beck continued. Your annotations were meticulous. Lucia met his gaze. You want me to stay? We need you to help stabilize the transition, he replied. Officially as legal liaison. Temporarily. For now, liaison. She exhaled slowly. Not from nerves. From the weight of hearing someone say it out loud. I accept, she said. Beck extended his hand. She shook it firmly. Later that evening, Lucia entered the room she once scrubbed on her knees. Only now, there was a nameplate on the desk. It hadn't been printed yet, but someone had placed a sticky note L. Reyes, interim liaison. She smiled. She placed the folder marked integrity into the drawer. Not hidden, one handed in a one serotonin. Just filed. Then she turned the chair slightly to face the window. The courthouse parking lot below was half empty. The sky had started to dim. For a moment, she sat in the quiet, listening to nothing. Not the shuffle of rubber soles, not the scrape of metal buckets, just stillness. She pressed her palms to the surface of the desk. Smooth. Israsher serum. Clean. Beaten real. This wasn't triumph. This wasn't revenge. It was right. Tessimon. For the first time in a long time, she closed the door from the inside. The latch clicked. Outside, someone knocked. A soft voice asked, "Mrs. Reyes, they're asking if you'll join the finance session downstairs." There's already pushback. She didn't sigh. She stood, straightened the note on her desk, and walked out again, quietly like she always had, but not as a shadow, this time as someone who stayed visible. The following weeks were nothing like calm. The audit team took over 3 offices. Files came out of drawers no one had touched in years. Emails were flagged, meetings replayed. Lucia sat through most of them, headset on, notepad open, translating when needed, asking questions when others were afraid. Susan worked across from her most days. They didn't talk about what had happened. They just worked, and slowly, something between them shifted. Respect, maybe, or understanding. By the second week, 5 senior staffers had resigned. One was escorted out. Wilson's nameplate was gone. A new plaque read pending appointment. Lucia reviewed budgets, redrafted communication protocols, and rewrote onboarding documents, this time in plain language. She didn't speak in meetings unless she had to. But when she did, people listened. Michael, the assistant from records, started bringing her coffee every 3rd morning. No words, just coffee. Once he left a sticky note. "You were right. We all saw it. We just didn't know how to name it." Lucia kept the note in her drawer. Outside, the building changed too. The reception got a real front desk. The security logs went digital. The bulletin board now included real updates, not just birthdays. And for the first time in years, no one had to whisper to tell the truth. In week 3, Lucia led her first internal session. No microphones, just a round table and a printed agenda. Her first proposal was simple. Any staff member could flag budget anomalies directly to oversight. No filter, no gatekeeping. A young clerk raised her hand to ask if that would be anonymous. Lucia replied, "It doesn't have to be, but it can be. What matters is that it's heard." Someone nodded. Then someone clapped. Not loud, but real. By the end of the month, the courthouse looked different. Not in paint or furniture, but in how people walked. They stood straighter. Spoke clearer. As Shantamasarnamun, the fear that once lived in the corners of every meeting room had retreated. Lucia moved through it all like always calm, deliberate. But now, staffers nodded first. Clerks held doors open. Someone had even fixed the vending machine near the archive room. She found herself invited to strategy calls, policy reviews, even lunch. Not out of politeness, out of recognition. Susan stopped by her office one Friday with a file and a peace offering a paper cup of chamomile tea. "I used to think being quiet meant being safe," Susan said. Lucia took the tea, smiled. "Being quiet isn't the problem. It's who benefits from our silence." Susan nodded slowly, then left the file. Inside were the revised audit protocols. Clean auditors, sure, transparent, signed. Lucia placed it in the cabinet labeled corrected. Final. Unrusum. As she did, she paused, one hand still on the drawer. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't marched. She hadn't threatened. But still, everything had changed. A week later, Lucia brought her mother to the courthouse. Margaret walked slowly, one hand on her cane, the other on Lucia's arm. Staff paused as they passed. One of the junior clerks stepped aside with a soft, "Welcome, Mrs. Sir Reyes." At the front desk, Mr. Pelton smiled wide and waved them through without asking for ID. Upstairs, Lucia guided her mother into the office she now called hers. Margaret sat by the window, watching the people below. "You built something here," she whispered. Lucia shook her head gently. "Nah!" "I repaired what mattered." The new banners went up quietly. No ceremony, no press release. It was just one phrase stretched above the courthouse entrance in clean black lettering. Integrity first. Some rolled their eyes, but most didn't. Because change wasn't a headline now, it was a habit. Lucia passed under the banner one morning, holding 2 file folders and a set of translated transcripts. She nodded to Mr. Pelton, and he saluted her with a thermos. No words. Inside, the community board had changed too. Beside the usual flyers and public hearings was a new sign-up sheet, Know Your Rights, free community legal clinics. Lucia had written the description herself. Simple, direct. We'll walk through basic legal rights, how to read court language, and who to call when something doesn't feel right. The first session filled in 2 days. On Thursday, the basement conference room overflowed. Folding chairs, hallway spillover, even a few perched on windowsills. Lucia stood at the front. No robe, no podium, just a whiteboard, a stack of printed packets, and her voice. She started with the basics. What due process means, what a contract really is, how power hides in fine print. No speeches, no slogans, just clarity. And they listened not because she had a title, but because she had lived it. After class, a teenager lingered near the whiteboard. She held a packet, corners folded from use. "Miss Reyes," she said, "how do you know when it's time to speak up?" Lucia smiled, but didn't answer right away. She erased the board, capped the marker, and turned. "When silence starts to feel like agreement," she said. The girl nodded, eyes wide. Word spread quickly. A second clinic was added. Then a third. Local teachers began attending. Even a former judge, not Wilson, volunteered to guest lecture. Lucia coordinated it all quietly. She didn't want a spotlight. She wanted structure. Outside, a mural appeared on the wall near the loading dock. Not flashy, just painted hands, open palms. Beneath them, in quiet blue strokes, "Truth doesn't shout." One morning, Lucia found a folded paper on her desk. No name, just a note. "My brother got through his eviction case because of that session." The thank you, she tucked it in her drawer. Next to the sticky note from Michael. Next to the first version of Clause 17b she ever translated. She didn't keep them as trophies. She kept them to remember why quiet mattered. And why it can't be mistaken for weakness again. If you've stayed with us this far, you already know this wasn't a story about a courtroom. It was a story about a janitor, a contract, a choice. And what happens when someone who was never meant to be heard decides to speak? Lucia Reyes never wore a badge. She never raised her voice. But she changed everything. Not with power, with persistence. She didn't fight a system with noise. She used the one thing they forgot: she had understanding. Now let us ask you, who's cleaning the corners of your world? Who's being overlooked until they're not? We tell these stories not to shock you, but to remind you that strength comes in silence. That courage doesn't always need a stage. That truth finds a way. If Lucia's story moved you, comment 100 below. Let us know where you're watching from. Your voice matters too. And if someone around you has been dismissed, underestimated, or ignored, share this story with them. Let them see what quiet can do. Because maybe the next change we need won't come from a title or a suit. Maybe it's already holding a mop, waiting, watching, ready here to name, waiting at the Follow Unveiled Wealth for more true stories of quiet strength. Because silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it's strategy.